Okay, so slight boo-boo. The sewing videos have started out really well in that I forgot to press play. The second half of the shirt alteration, so altering the length of the shirt, we've recorded, so all is well. So Phoebe's not with me currently. I'm filming this solo, and I'll be using a substitute shirt with pins that were placed exactly as they were on Luka's to show you just this first little segment about shortening your shirt cuff. So all is well, and I just have to do this twice. Imagine that this is Luka's wonderful shirt, and we had the pins that we placed into his sleeve. The first step for any alteration that you're about to take on is to make notes as to what that alteration is so that you can take those pins out safely and you've recorded them to refer back to as and when you need. So I'm going to measure here from the fold over here that's being held in place by the pin down to where that pin is. And I'm measuring about 1 inch and 5/8. I then pull this back and go to the other one, and again measuring maybe about 1 inch and 3/4 on that one. Now these pins are pinned out almost identically, which is good news for us. If, however, you find that your pins are slightly different from one another, and one is measuring, say, for instance, 1 3/4, and the other is measuring 1 1/4, then find the average between the two, and then multiply that by 2 in order to work out what the full length you pinned out is. So I've got 1 inch and 5/8 basically twice on the front pin and the rear pin, so I'm going to multiply 1 inch and 5/8 by 2. Why do I multiply it by 2? Well, because we've pinned this out on the double. So for instance, if I were to put a chalk in here on one side of the pin and then put a chalk in on the other side of the pin and then removed my pin and remove that one, the distance between those two marks over here and over there measures 3 1/4, 1 inch and 5/8 times 2. So shortening the cuff, you'll see over here that we have our little button, which we're going to open, and we're going to measure up the cuff by 3 1/4 inches. Now I'm going to pop a little chalk mark in here, and you can see how it's going above that buttonhole and that button, and it's coming quite close in to the end of that cuff opening. If you found that your cuff needs to be shortened basically on the buttonhole or very close to it, you can either go either side of it or go straight across it. It doesn't really matter too much, but you will have to sacrifice that buttonhole. That is the slight compromise. So 3 1/4 inches cuff reduction is what we have, and I want to now cut my shirt sleeve in order to shorten it. Before I do that, I will remove my cuff. So you should do this with an unpicker, because the stitches are usually quite small and quite difficult to get hold of. And just very delicately remove the stitches that are maintaining the cuff in place. There may be 2, one stitch from the inside and one stitch from the outside. In any case, remove them both. Once you've freed it up enough, you can delicately pull those stitches apart. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this if you felt that your stitches were strong, but you can usually get away with it. Next step is to remove all your threads that are peeking out. There and there. And then we've got our freed sleeve. So this mark here that we made is where we want the sleeve cuff to butt into. We need to be careful here though, because we need a seam allowance in order for the cuff to grab onto the sleeve. So instead of cutting to this line, we're going to cut to a line which sits 3 1/4 inches up from the raw edge. We'll apply that line 3 times across the sleeve, one in the middle of it and once on the other extremity. The next step is to connect those lines. So flattening out my sleeve, like so, and then coming to the other side and marking it across as well. And now we chop. It's always best to cut with your shears flat on the board. There we go. Now we're going to baste the cuff back into place. So grab some basting cotton. Something to bear in mind before we put this cuff back on is that you'll remark that if I look at the original seam that cuff was attached to, there was a pleat in the sleeve at that point, which sat about 1.5 inches from the top of the shirt cuff. We need to replicate this pleat, otherwise the new seam that we've made over here is going to be still too big as well for our cuff to fit in. So we're going to reduce it by replicating that pleat in and bringing that measure back to the same as the cuff. Starting from the other end to the pleat, we're going to work our way this way across to the top of the cuff, and then we're going to pleat in right at the end so that we get the exact measure that we want. Coming in here, add your cuff back in and start basting away, making sure that the cuff here, this little opening that you have, is eating up that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance included in your sleeve, and you're sandwiching it in between those two layers of the cuff. That can be a little bit tricky to do, so take your time, but you just sandwich it in there and make sure that you're grabbing both layers on either side, and with your needle baste it in to place. Like that. So as you can see here, on the other side, my stitches are catching through to all layers and making sure that that seam allowance is contained inside. We're now coming into that area of the cuff where the pleat was included. So we're going to simply lay the end of the sleeve back into the end of the cuff, grab a pin, secure it into place like that, and then fold whatever's in excess over here back in so that it all fits into place. Can be a bit fiddly, but don't worry. And as you reach the end, back tack everything into place. Now, all you have left to do is to fell the cuff in. So grab some thread, which is the same color as your shirt. Don't use basting cotton if your shirt is white, because basting cotton is very fragile and won't hold your cuff properly. And then simply come into the front here. So I'm going to disguise my stitch by sneaking it inside the cuff like this. And I'm going to come back out and through the very start of the cuff. That's my stitch disguised in place. I'm then going to just back tack and then come through and fill that in. Now, as you can see here, I'm catching just the littlest bit of my cuff on the other side. My needles come right in front of where it first came in, and then it's traveling 1/4 of an inch and coming out on the very edge of the cuff a little further forwards. And then I come back in and I repeat those stitches all the way along, coming in right in front of where my stitch initially came out from, coming through to the other side of the cuff, catching it just a little bit over there, and then traveling inside and coming out a little further forwards on the very edge of the cuff. And repeat this all the way along. Now this stitch should be fairly discreet. It shouldn't be very visible once it's finished. If you want to machine this, you can. You would just simply straight stitch 1/8 off the edge of the cuff at the top and catch both layers of the cuff, sandwiching the sleeve. Now coming into the end, things are a little bit thick with your last stitch. Same thing as the first one. back tack it, and then go through to the other side, pop it into the cuff where it's not visible, within the edge right over here, back tack a few times, and then snip. Now you can remove your baste. And there you have your sewn cuff. There's something else you can do to help out with the fit of the sleeve. And very often it's not what really controls the length of the sleeve along your hand isn't so much the length of the sleeve itself, but also how tight the cuff fits around your wrist. And that prevents the cuff from coming past this bone of the thumb. Luka's cuff was a little loose on his hand, so we're going to move these buttons in an inch just to make that cuff feel a little bit tighter on him and to prevent it from really riding down onto the hand. You can pull these in a little bit further more if you want. Just bear in mind that when you do, you're going to create a little kink over here in the placket, but your suit sleeve does cover it, so it's not really that important. What is important though is that your shirt cuff doesn't slide down past this bone in your hand over there. Now to move them in an inch, we're going to make a little mark 1 inch out from the center of the original button. We're going to trace a little crisscross there, and we're going to take that button off and resew it back on there. Now remove that button, take away those old threads, and this time you're going to thread your needle on the double. So 2 strands of cotton for your needle, get to the ends, trim them to the same length, and then make a little knot connecting them both. And then trim back about 1/8 from that knot. Start by grabbing your cuff and popping your needle into the crisscross and just coming all the way through the layers and biting a little bit of the underside of the cuff. Then grab your button, go through one hole and come out of the opposing hole, and then go back in to the same spot, doing exactly the same stitch you just did, and pull that button all the way down. Then go through one of the holes that hasn't had thread in yet and come out of the opposite hole, and again stitch it back in. And just do that a couple more times on each hole. 2 or 3 should do it. Last step, grab some tension on that thread and coil it round 6 times around the stem of the button, and then grab your needle and thread it through that stem. Do that once more, and then do that again, and this time coil your thread over your needle to form a little knot, and one last time go through your stem. Then snip off and repeat the process for the other button. And it is just that simple to shorten a shirt cuff. We're now going to head on over with Phoebe to go and shorten the shirt body. So we now have our shirt cuffs shortened, and we wanted to show how to take in darts. So Luka did not want the shirt to be any tighter than it currently is, but if you did want it to be tighter, then you can see that on the back there are these 2 lines here, either side of the side seam, right? And these are called darts. And what differentiates a dart from a seam is that a dart ends in a panel, right? So it ends here inside this blob of cloth rather than it joining 2 blobs of cloth together. And if you wanted to make the shirt more narrow through the waist, you, as we did in our fitting, could pin however much you wanted to take out of the dart over here, and you would have an amount to pin out. So here I pinned out 1/4 inch either side. So 1/2 inch I'd be taking out total. So I would then flip the shirt over, mark where the waist was, where I pinned them, and then you would draw a line, which was, so say I pinned on this location here, I'd remove 1/4 inch from there, and then I draw a line, so up to the top of the dart, and then down back to the original point at the bottom. And then I would either machine stitch or back stitch on this line.
And would you do this before or after the hem?
I'd do this before the hem. Good point. Yes, do it before the hem. Because if the hem eats into the bottom of the dart, then it's a bit harder to sew, as is the case over here. Yeah. And simply put, that would take in your shirt, wouldn't it? So don't forget, all you'd need to do is to make sure that you back tacked up here and down at the bottom. And which stitch would we use? Back stitch?
Back stitch, yeah.
Back stitch if you were doing it by hand, and a normal straight stitch on the machine. So we can begin to shorten the shirt. So we've got pins in the bottom over here that are marking the end of the shirt at the back, and that are marking the end of the shirt at the front as we pinned it on Luka. So what we'll do is we'll measure how much we need to shorten this by on the front and back. So on the front, we want to shorten the shirt by 3¼ inches. So we make a note of that. And on the back, we pinned it to shorten it by 4½ inches. So I can now remove those pins. And then we can begin marking for where the shirt needs to be shortened. Now, you'll notice that the shirt is shorter at the sides than it is at the front and the back. So all we need to do is keep that same shape going through. So we're going to mark 3½ inches at the front where that shortens to. Sorry, 3¼ inches we said. That's marked there with a bit of chalk. 4½ inches at the back. There. And then we're going to run a curve into that back. So we can see, if we lay the tape measure over here, that the back rises by, the side seam, sorry, rises by 2½ inches. So if I connect that to there, and pop a little mark in here and rise it by 2½ inches, I'll keep the same shape. And all you do is draw it in.
Is there something that has to be perfect?
No.
No.
It doesn't have to be perfect at all. It's going to be hidden beneath your trousers in any case, so it won't be very visible. And then we do the same thing on the other side. And there we have it. So what we need to look out for is something called a seam allowance, which we've already approached in the making of the cuff, but which we need to be very mindful of now. How many seam allowances should we leave?
2.
2. And we're leaving 2 because we're turning over the bottom of the shirt twice. So if we only leave the 1 seam allowance, we'd end up with a raw edge on the inside of the bottom. So we're going to leave 2 seam allowances so it can tuck in a little bit further. And we're going to make these seam allowances 1/4 inch. Sounds good?
Yeah.
So we're leaving 2 times 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, all the way around the bottom of the shirt. So what you can do is grab your ruler and make marks all along the bottom of the shirt, like this, which are a 1/2 inch down from the line that you drew. Have you got any tips on doing this more quickly? Eyeball it.
Yeah, and not draw a straight line whatsoever, and use a blunt chalk.
There. So you'll notice that we have 2 buttons here, which are extra buttons in case we lose one on the shirt. So we can literally just take those off because they're now looking a little bit low, and one of them is even going to get chopped off. So I'll just remove these and we can sew them in to the label in the shirt afterwards to keep them in place. Oops, there we go. So, choppy. So when you're cutting, make sure that you're cutting flat against the board and make sure that nothing is beneath it. This you can now chuck away. And we're now going to start turning up the bottom of the shirt. So you need to turn it up 1/4 inch first, and then another 1/4 inch to disguise that raw edge. So we'll just show it a little bit more zoomed. We need to turn up the shirt 1/4 inch, like that, and then turn it up another 1/4 inch all the way along. Now the easiest thing to do is to press it into place before you start stitching it. So that's what we're going to do.
This part's always really fiddly for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be a bit annoying. So, doof. If you're confident, you can go straight in and sew it, can't you?
I would baste 1/4 inch and then
Oh,
press
really?
it and then roll it up again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is an option. If your iron's hot enough, you should be able to get a nice crease in the cotton, and it should be fairly easy. Now we kept the same curve in the bottom of the shirt, but you don't have to really, do you? You can keep a straight line if you wanted, and if that were easier for you.
Yeah, it's just to tuck your shirt in and things like that.
The shirt's longer in the front and in the back so that it doesn't come out. And an excess of shirt at the sides is, I mean, you can usually feel it a little bit. But yeah, it's not the end of the world if you leave it in there. Again, this doesn't have to be the neatest thing either. It's all hidden away. That's one side, one fold done. And now we fold it again by that same amount. This is where it gets a little bit more fiddly. That's not too bad.
Does your iron have a fit on it? Yeah.
Yeah.
The number of times I've burnt so many things with my home iron.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at uni they've got a foot on it, so like I can be a bit more at ease, but still it's an iron.
So what temperature would you recommend home irons to be at?
I don't know, well, we're working with cotton, so probably whatever the cotton setting is, if I'm being honest.
There's no harm in being cold, is
Yeah,
there?
there is absolutely no harm.
Having a lower temperature is never a bad thing. You just let things cook for a little bit longer, that's all.
Yeah.
But at least you're not at risk of...
Yeah, I've burnt many things.
Yeah, don't burn anything.
It was like wool setting all the way up, so crispy.
And yeah, you don't necessarily need steam either, do you?
No, it just used to be hot and like a weight.
Yeah.
That's fine.
How's uni going?
It's going fine. I mean, I've got, like I said, I'm in the studio all the time. Putting the base together, it seems like I'm taking forever to do like a dart.
Yeah.
But it's coming along.
Phoebe's making her own jacket.
Yeah, I'm putting my base together. sewing in darts, canvassing, things like that.
All of which is available on the channel.
On the All Sujet channel.
Oh, thanks for the plug. Right, so that's done. So now we have two options. We can either stitch it by hand or stitch it by machine if you have one. If you have a machine, just a straight stitch along the very edge of that fold will do just fine. But it's fine to stitch by hand as well, it doesn't take too long. And it's just a fell stitch, right?
Yeah, same as the cuff.
So assuming that most of you won't have a machine at home, we're going in solidarity to be stitching this by hand. There you go.
Ta.
And Phoebe's conveniently left-handed, so we can work from either end of the shirt.
And we'll meet in the middle.
And meet in the middle.
Like the Eurostar.
I was going to say, like, what's the pasta movie?
The pasta movie?
The two dogs.
Oh, like Lady and the Tramp?
Lady and the Tramp, the pasta movie. Like the Eurostar. So yeah, just a fell stitch. So disguise your start and then stitch away.
Oh, my hands are sweaty. Don't have sweaty hands for this.
Starts off well.
When I was a home sewer, which is, albeit not much, I was like an uber perfectionist, and I didn't really care for hand sewing because I was like, oh, I won't be strong. How can I do my own thing? Like, how can I make anything without a sewing machine? That's ridiculous. Everything will just fall apart. It's like, nah.
No, hand stitches.
Yeah, power of a backstitch.
Yeah.
Power of a backstitch.
Power of a backstitch.
It just takes a bit long. But if you get good at it, it's a really good skill to have.
Yeah. Not to mention that clothes up until the arrival of the sewing machine in the mid-19th were entirely sewn out by hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, completely fine. And also all of the high-end fashion houses and sort of Savile Row firms making the finest clothing around, all predominantly stitch things by hand, aside from straight seams, right?
Yeah.
So
I did the shirt squiffy.
you did a bit squiff. We don't mind squiff, do we?
We don't mind squiff.
As long as it's sewn, we're happy.
Yeah, try not to do that and keep everything straight.
Yeah, a little bit of mess isn't like the end of the world.
Yeah.
I think the point is to be encouraged by simply putting things together in a way that will look nice, you know?
And it's really gratifying as well.
People don't notice the tiny finer detail.
Yeah.
At higher levels of sewing, yeah, you might want to go over it, but you know, for someone who's wearing something on a day-to-day, this goes completely unnoticed.
Yeah. And I have knotted my thread.
OMG.
Ta.
What would you say to people who are so annoyed by the thimble that they've taken it off by now?
You're talking to the right person. Just do it. Just do it.
No! Shame on you.
No, I'm joking. No, sewing with a thimble at the start was really hard. But now I'm just one of those people who can't sew without it. It just makes everything faster, and you can sew through like way thicker materials. And if you're doing like, you know, classical tailoring as we know it, it's actually quite a key thing to have to canvas up and do waistbands and things like that. But yeah, just start now. Just start now and then you'll get used to it. It might be really hard at the start, but it's literally fine.
So I've just got to the side seam here, so I put a tiny little tack in, just so that everything that I've worked on up until now is going to be held in place. So if this stitch were to accidentally undo for whatever reason, then it would only undo along this line and wouldn't continue down the other end of the shirt. And so you can pop a tack in at either side seam just to help that out. Yeah. So it's less to repair if anything does mess up. So I'm coming to the end of my stitch here. So I'm just gonna back tack right on the edge so that the stitch doesn't unravel. A few times like that. So you can see that over there. So I've just wound the stitch round itself a few times, just right on the edge. And now I can snip off the end and then make another knot or back tack again and then start over.
What needles are these?
These are John James Betweens number 7.
7.
My needle of choice.
I like the little peewee, like 8 and upwards.
You like 8 and upwards?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like a 10 for. So the higher the number, the smaller the needle, right?
Yeah.
And betweens are thicker and slightly more blunt, and sharps are thinner and sharper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the little 10s for tiny little fellings. This is good for 10 actually. It's like how you take your tea, isn't it?
Yeah. Because like my hands are like decently small, so if I'm dealing with anything 6 or below, it's just, that's a harpoon. That's a harpoon.
So as you're coming around the curves, they will stretch and gather a little bit depending on which direction the curve's going in. And that doesn't matter. You just need to even it out, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yay! We have finished.
Slip these loose threads off. There we go.
So once we're done, press all of that one final time. Make sure it's all looking nice and smooth. Et voila! We have the shirt finished. Banging. So that's all it takes.
Yeah.
Pretty simple.
It's quite relaxing as well.